Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Auschwitz and the Allies, a devastating account of how the Allies responded to the news of Hitler's mass murder, by Martin Gilbert, narrated by Roger Clark. Introduction to the Pimlico edition. The stages by which the Allies learned of the Nazi mass murder of the Jews and of how they responded form the foundation of this book. To this end, I have given particular prominence to those atrocity reports which were received in the West during the war itself, and have traced the Allied reaction to them. This book is an account of the facts of the killings as they filtered out of Nazi-dominated Europe, and of the Allied reaction to these facts, beginning with a series of explicit, but, as so often, incomplete reports, which reached London and Washington during the summer and autumn of 1942. In order to show the gap between what was known at any given time and what was actually taking place, I have also outlined the principal deportations and murders as they happened, making it clear whenever the facts were unknown to the Allies at the time. It was not until the summer of 1944 that the Allies knew that Jews were being deported to Auschwitz from throughout Europe and were being murdered there. This knowledge, hitherto kept secret, obscured, and not therefore a part of the many protests against the killing of Jews, had been smuggled out of Auschwitz itself by two pairs of Jewish escapees, whose story I tell. The Allies also received in the summer of 1944 a third account of the fate of the Jews inside Auschwitz, which reached the West through a Polish medical student, a non-Jew, who had also escaped from the camp. The aim of this book is to show how the Allies and the Jewish organizations outside Nazi-dominated Europe that were monitoring the fate of their fellow Jews responded to each new piece of information as it reached them, starting in the very first months of the war. Often those in the West only learned of specific killings long after they had taken place. Unfortunately, for any decisive response, the period during which the facts first became known in detail, and during which most of the 6 million Jewish victims of Nazism were being killed, coincided with the period of maximum German military superiority and corresponding Allied military weakness. Throughout the war, the Germans pursued a policy of deliberate and almost always effective deception with regard to mass murder. In 1944, as that deception began to fail, Allied protests grew, and such help as could be given to the Jews was intensified. This culminated in the threat to bomb targets in Budapest if the Hungarian government continued to allow Jews to be deported. This threat led to the Hungarian government refusing to allow the Germans to deport the 100,000 Jews in Budapest in July 1944. But the murder of Jews somewhere or other within the German domains only stopped when Germany itself was overrun by the Allies, and the camps, among them Belsen and Dachau, were liberated in April and May 1945. Anthony Eden, the British Foreign Secretary, was right when he said in the summer of 1944 that the principal hope of bringing the killings to an end remained the speedy victory of the Allied nations. The Nazi killing machine had the power and the will to continue behind German lines until Germany itself was overrun. Martin Gilbert, Merton College, Oxford, 21st of March, 2001. Part 1. The Final Solution. Prelude. Hitler's Pledge. The Complete Annihilation of the Jews. Adolf Hitler had written and spoken against the Jews without respite from the end of the First World War until the beginning of the Second. In his book Mein Kampf and in his speeches he had portrayed the Jew as a parasite, a bacillus and a vampire, bleeding all nations to death and corrupting all that was noble and healthy in Aryan and German life. In Mein Kampf, Hitler blamed the defeat of Germany in the First World War on the Marxist leaders, and he argued that if, at the beginning of the war, or even during it, 12 or 15,000 of these Jews who were corrupting the nation had been forced to submit to poison gas, then the millions of deaths at the front would not have been in vain. Indeed, Hitler added, if 12,000 of these malefactors had been eliminated in proper time, probably the lives of 1,000,000 decent men, who would be of value to Germany in the future, might have been saved. Immediately on coming to power in 1933, Hitler's laws began to deprive German Jews systematically of all their rights of citizenship. These rights were finally taken away in 1935 by the Nuremberg laws. At the same time, a brutal, crude, daily anti-Semitism drove more than 250,000 Jews, half of German Jewry, into exile. In every town and village, public slogans declared, "The Jew is our misfortune," "Jews not wanted here," and "Let Judah perish." Threats against the Jews were the stock in trade of Nazism. So, too, was open violence, culminating in November 1938 in the destruction of hundreds of synagogues. And on the 30th of January 1939, 6 years after the Nazis had come to power, Hitler declared publicly that in the event of war, the result will not be the Bolshevization of the earth, and thus the victory of Jewry, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. Within a few weeks of the German invasion of Poland on the 1st of September 1939, many hundreds of Jews had been murdered in the streets of a dozen towns, and thousands more had been savagely beaten up throughout German-occupied Poland. Jewish shops were looted, homes ransacked, and synagogues destroyed by the SS. Yet an even worse fate, it seemed, was planned for the 2 million Polish Jews who were now under German rule, for on the 16th of December 1939, The Times published an article which included the headline, "A Stony Road to Extermination." This article told of the establishment inside German-occupied Poland of a special remainder state, which was to be set aside as a Jewish reserve. According to the Times, the Germans intended to deport more than 1 million Jews into this concentration area. These Jews would be brought from every country then under German rule, all 180,000 Jews who were still living in Germany itself, all 65,000 from Austria, all 75,000 from the Czech Protectorate, and all 450,000 from the western provinces of Poland, now annexed to Germany. In addition, nearly 1.5 million Jews from Poland itself would be uprooted from their homes and sent to this special area. It was clear, the Times added, that the aim of the scheme was to set up a place for gradual extermination, and not what the Germans would describe as a Lebensraum, or living space. The article in the Times pinpointed the area concerned as the barren district around Lublin, and included a map. The whole program, it stated, amounts to a mass massacre such as Nazi imagination can conceive, but even Nazi practice can hardly carry through in full. The deportations to this Lublin land had already begun. As many as 10,000 Jews had already been taken there by train from the former Czech town of Moravska Ostrava. An escapee who had reached the West through Russia had told the story of this early deportation, and the Times reported it fully. Even those who were seriously ill had not been exempted from deportation. At the same time, hundreds of thousands of Jews remained in the newly created ghettos of Poland, or were sent to labor camps on the Soviet border to build fortifications, while hundreds of thousands more Jews came under Nazi rule as the German armies conquered Denmark and Norway in April 1940, France, Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg in June 1940, and Greece and Yugoslavia in April 1941. Meanwhile, the Lublin Land scheme had been abandoned, and nearly 3 million Jews throughout Poland, Central Europe, and Western Europe lived in their homes and ghettos. Gradually, throughout 1940, they had been isolated from the communities around them, of which they had for so long been a part. In country after country, they were forced to wear the yellow badge, were turned out of the schools, were forbidden to practice as doctors, teachers, or lawyers, and were made to suffer the daily indignities of prejudice and scorn. Another feature of Nazi rule was the concentration camp. By the summer of 1941, there were more than a dozen of these camps, and hundreds of smaller labor camps and prison centers scattered throughout the Reich. These camps were filled with German opponents of Nazism, with homosexuals and others judged to be enemies of the new social order, with Polish intellectuals and political prisoners, but to a lesser extent, with Jews. Brutality ruled supreme in these camps, where death from savage beatings was a daily event. On the 3rd of May 1941, the Polish government in exile sent a formal note to the governments of all the Allied and neutral powers describing how tens of thousands of Polish citizens had been incarcerated in concentration or internment camps, and it went on to refer specifically to 4 such camps: Oswiecim, Auschwitz, Oranienburg, Mauthausen, and Dachau, as camps whose names will mark the most horrible pages in the annals of German bestiality. In a series of appendices, the Polish note contained nearly 200 eyewitness reports of ill treatment and torture in several dozen concentration camps and detention centers. Appendix 168A was a 3-page summary of testimonials and reports about Auschwitz. This summary referred to events at Auschwitz up to November 1940, at a time when Poles, not Jews, constituted the majority of the prisoners there. It described, for example, how, as a reprisal for the killing of 2 guards, a large group of prisoners were taken out into a field, ordered to run about, and machine-gunned by the Germans. The dead were then burned in the local crematorium. On another occasion, a man who had been shot in the stomach for the crime of obtaining a double ration was thrown into the crematorium while still alive. At one prolonged roll call, 86 prisoners had died from exposure and beatings. The report on Auschwitz ended with a summary which contained its only reference to the Jews. The summary read, "At the end of November 1940, 8,000 Poles were at the Oswiecim camps." Theoretically, the prisoners were divided into 3 groups: 1. Political prisoners, 2. Criminals, 3. Priests and Jews. This last group was persecuted most of all. Scarcely any of them came out alive. In the first days of December, Warsaw post offices dispatched several hundred death notices relating to Oswiecim prisoners. In the Warsaw district of Zoliborz alone, 84 such notifications were received. About December 20th, 260 more of them were sent. Some 200 bodies of prisoners are being burned in the crematorium each week. Although by 1941 Hitler had been fulminating against the Jews for 8 years, the persecution of Jews was still not thought of as a specially important propaganda theme in Allied broadcasts and articles. Indeed, on the 25th of July 1941, a Ministry of Information document had warned British policymakers that to make the Nazi danger credible to the British people, it should not be too extreme, as concentration camp stories repel the normal mind. A certain amount of horror was needed, the document conceded, but it must be used very sparingly, and must deal always with treatment of indisputably innocent people, not with violent political opponents, and not with Jews. But Hitler's threat to annihilate the Jews of Europe had not been mere rhetoric. All Hitler lacked was opportunity, and that opportunity came in June 1941, as the German armies, already masters of Western Europe, invaded the Soviet Union. From the very first days of the German invasion of Russia, special Nazi killing squads, or Einsatzgruppen, had moved eastwards behind the German army, using the terror and confusion of war as a cover under which to round up hundreds of thousands of Jews in town after town and village after village, and to shoot them down on the spot. The systematic mass murder of the Jews had begun. The slaughter of as many as 500,000 Jews in the newly conquered territories of Western Russia and the Baltic states did not satisfy the Nazi desire to eliminate Jewish life from Europe. Instead, it stimulated the search for a final solution. In the autumn of 1941, experiments had been made in seizing Jews in German-occupied Yugoslavia, and in killing them in specially sealed vans, where the exhaust pipe had been turned back into the interior of the van. In September 1941, a further experiment had been made on non-Jews, when 700 Soviet prisoners of war and 300 Poles at Auschwitz were forced at gunpoint into a hermetically sealed cellar, into which poison gas was then pumped. Throughout the night their screams had sounded throughout the camp, but by morning all had been killed and other prisoners made to carry the bodies from the cellar to the camp crematorium. News of this particular experiment did not become known in the West for more than 6 months. Continuing with the experiments, in November 1941 the Gestapo selected some 1,200 Jewish slave laborers who were then in Buchenwald concentration camp inside Germany itself, certified them as insane, took them by train to the Euthanasia Institute at Bernberg near Berlin, and gassed them in rooms specially prepared for the experiment. The success of these various experiments suggested to the Nazi leaders a possible means of murdering hundreds of thousands and indeed millions of people. In the late autumn of 1941, as the war entered its third year, there were still as many as 2 million Jews living in German-occupied Poland alone. Smaller but once flourishing Jewish communities were to be found throughout the confines of German-dominated Europe, bringing to more than 4 million the number of Jews living in areas ruled or dominated by Germany. In Poland, the Jews had been confined to crowded ghettos since the beginning of the war. They had already suffered terribly from forced labor, hunger, and disease. At the same time, tens of thousands of Jews had been deported from Germany and Austria to these eastern ghettos. During 1941, more than 15,000 Jews died of starvation in the Łódź ghetto, and more than 40,000 in the Warsaw ghetto, as a result of deliberate German policy. These facts were not entirely unknown to the Western Allies. On the 16th of November 1941, the British minister to Sweden, Victor Mallet, spoke at length to a Swedish economic negotiator who had just returned from Germany. The Swede told the Englishman, who at once reported it back to London, that many Germans were disgusted at the way in which Jews are being deported from German cities to ghettos in Poland. The fate of those deported, the Swede had been told, was a lingering death. On November 19th, only 3 days after this meeting in Sweden, a member of the British legation in Switzerland, David Kelly, reported from Bern on a conversation with a Polish diplomat, responsible now to the Polish government in exile in London, who told him that about 1.5 million Jews who were living in eastern, recently Russian Poland have simply disappeared altogether. Nobody knows how or where. At the same time, the Dutch minister in Bern had told Kelly that 50% of the Dutch Jews sent to camps are now dead. On November 22nd, a junior Brazilian diplomat, Carlos Buarque de Macedo, who was then second secretary at the Brazilian embassy in Berlin, arrived in Lisbon for an 8-day visit to Portugal. During his visit, he and his wife spoke to a member of the British embassy in Lisbon, who noted down their remarks and sent them to the Foreign Office in London. The treatment of Jews, the Brazilian reported, is getting more appalling every day. Thousands are being packed into open lorries and sent off to Poland without food or water or stops at night. The Brazilian added, "So bad is the treatment of Jews now that even pro-German Portuguese diplomats are so horrified that they have helped to organize the marriage of 6 Jews with money to Portuguese to enable them to be got out of Germany." The Jews living outside Nazi-dominated Europe had no access to these diplomatic reports, but the Zionist movement, once so strong in Central and Eastern Europe, did have its own listening posts, in both Switzerland and Turkey, to which information was continually being smuggled. In Geneva, the World Jewish Congress, a body set up shortly before the war to keep a special watch on anti-Jewish activities, was likewise the recipient of news and reports. In Jerusalem, the Jewish Agency for Palestine, the Zionist body which had been set up 20 years earlier by the British government as its liaison with the Jews of Palestine, likewise received reports on an almost weekly basis from Switzerland and from Istanbul. One such report was sent from Gerhard Riegner, the World Jewish Congress representative in Geneva, to his superiors in New York, in a letter dated 27th of October 1941. It told of renewed deportations from Germany and Czechoslovakia to Poland, of the horror of deportation, and of the terrible conditions inside Poland itself. An eyewitness told me recently, Riegner reported, that there are currently 2,000 cases of typhus in the Warsaw Ghetto. Riegner urged the dispatch from neutral governments of a humanitarian mission of Protestant leaders to the deportation regions, as well as Protestant intervention with the Red Cross and a solemn declaration by the many governments in exile in London declaring all anti-Jewish laws passed by the occupying powers and their collaborators as null and void. A month later, on November 27th, a second report from Geneva was sent to Istanbul by the Jewish Agency representatives and then forwarded from Istanbul to Jerusalem. The subject of this further report was Hitler's New Order in Europe. The message was brief but succinct. With regard to the Jews, Jerusalem was informed, it seems that no place whatever has been allotted to them in Hitler's Europe, and the remnants who escaped the massacres, starvation, and oppression of the ghettos are no doubt intended to be sent somewhere overseas. But according to the evolving Nazi intentions, not even the remnants were to be spared. The massive death tolls of the ghettos were no longer sufficient for the now triumphant Nazis, as they pondered the twin success of their eastern killing squads and Germany's military dominance in Europe. At the existing death rate, high though it was, Warsaw Jewry, for example, would not be destroyed completely for another 10 years. But with the German army at the gates of Moscow and most of the capitals of Europe at Germany's beck and call, the Nazis were attracted by the idea of a more rapid and systematic plan, by which the murder of millions of Jews could be carried out according to a clear and competent schedule. By using the most efficient and modern methods, it was clear that there need not be even remnants once the plan was completed. The first step in carrying out this new plan was taken on the 8th of December 1941, when several hundred Jews from 3 small Polish towns were taken to a wood outside the village of Chełmno and gassed in a specially designed building. The experiment was judged a success by the Nazi planners. It was also a closely guarded secret. The Chełmno gassing had begun as an experiment. The decision to destroy all the Jews of Nazi-controlled Europe was still to be discussed and finalized at a meeting summoned for December 9th in the Wannsee suburb of Berlin. Those invited to Wannsee were senior officials from all the German ministries, including the Ministry of Justice and the Foreign Office. The details of the conference were prepared by Adolf Eichmann, head of the special Jewish section of the SS. 2 days before the conference was due to meet, however, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and on December 11th, Germany declared war on the United States. The conference was therefore postponed until January 20th. Meanwhile, as the German officials waited to assemble on the new date, the Soviet government published details of hundreds of atrocities that had been committed against Russian civilians as the German armies had advanced across Russia during the 6 previous months, between June and December 1941. These details were set out on the 6th of January 1942, in a note signed by the Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, one of the signatories, scarcely 2 years earlier, of the notorious Nazi-Soviet Pact. The Molotov note of January 6th gave a stark, town-by-town account of what it described as abominable violence, outrage, and massacre. Although in no way concerned with separating the fate of Soviet Jews from other Soviet citizens, the note made clear in several of its paragraphs the extent to which the Jews had been singled out as victims. Indeed, one paragraph of the Molotov note dealt explicitly with the fate of the Jews of Kiev, as reported by Soviet citizens who had escaped. The paragraph read, "A large number of Jews, including women and children of all ages, was gathered in the Jewish cemetery of Kiev. Before they were shot, all were stripped naked and beaten. The first persons selected for shooting were forced to lie face down at the bottom of a ditch and were shot with automatic rifles. Then the Germans threw a little earth over them. The next group of people awaiting execution was forced to lie on top of them and shot, and so on." A further paragraph of the Molotov note of January 6th gave details of the work of the mass murders of the killing squads in the Ukraine. These bloody executions, the note pointed out, were especially directed against unarmed and defenseless Jewish working people, and it went on to give the numbers killed, according to what were called incomplete figures. These figures were no less than 6,000 in Lvov, 8,000 in Odessa, over 8,500 killed or hanged in Kamenets-Podolsk, over 10,500 persons shot down with machine guns in Dnepropetrovsk, about 7,000 persons in Kirch, and over 3,000 shot in Mariupol, including many old men, women, and children, all of whom were robbed and stripped naked before execution. The Molotov note was made public in the Soviet city of Kuybyshev on the 7th of January 1942, when it was handed to all foreign diplomats in the city, to which the diplomatic corps had been withdrawn in the face of the German advance. In London, on January 13th, representatives of 9 occupied countries, Poland, Belgium, Czechoslovakia, France, Greece, Yugoslavia, Luxembourg, Holland, and Norway, having constituted themselves an inter-allied conference on war crimes, issued a joint declaration condemning German atrocities against civilians in occupied Europe. One of the groups pressing for just such a declaration had been the World Jewish Congress. While not mentioning the Jews by name, the joint declaration spoke of a regime of terror characterized in particular by imprisonments, mass expulsions, execution of hostages, and massacres, and agreed to place, among its principal war aims, the
Sample complete. Ready to continue?